Hello, I'm Andy Schmuckler, and this is the next installment, the seventh, I think, in a series of things that are talking about the best understanding of evil. And let me just say a couple of things about evil. With the liberal audience, I know that there's a resistance to the idea that there's anything to be called evil. And people imagine that they know what I mean by evil, and let me just say, I have a definition of evil, which I think actually corresponds to what we've traditionally understood to be evil. But this is something I say as a social scientist. And what important thing to note is that I'm putting forward here is social science, things that I believe that we can reasonably conclude are true that are also illuminating of the nature of the world that we have to deal with. So I say that there is this definition, a coherent force that consistently works to make things in the human world worse or to make them more broken. If you would accept that if such a thing could be identified, it wouldn't be unreasonable to call it evil, since that's pretty much how we've understood it whenever there's talk of over the millennia of a force of evil. I think it has a lot in common with that it's an it of some kind, something that isn't just a bunch of different things that have no cohesion to them. And then the question would be, if you would accept that that would be, if you could prove the existence of such a coherent force, would you be then satisfied to identify it as an it? Maybe call it evil, but if you don't like evil, then call it a force of destruction or a force of brokenness. In the language I'm trying to propose as a social theorist, is that those are just equivalent. I actually think that there's something about our relationship with evil, though it gets in the way of our understanding it if you think that I'm talking in a supernatural zone. No, there's something about the response that we give to it, if a force of brokenness, even if that's all we call it. But anyway, I think that there's a power to the word evil because of all the history. But we don't have to worry about the name as long as we can see the it. And then I claimed in an earlier part of this series to show that there is such a thing as such a coherent force. I feel that I argue pretty persuasively that if you look in the network of causes and effects, like you look at this thing, which let's just say some terrible thing in the human world, of which we always have quite a few to choose among, and you ask yourself, well, what are the causes that led to this brokenness that we see here at this point in time, later than the causes? I think you would find that, I've struggled with this, but I think overwhelmingly the causes of the broken thing will be other broken things. Maybe not, even probably not broken in all the same ways. But that's what I also suggested, is you can see a pattern of brokenness, whether it goes from the brokenness of war to the brokenness of trauma. There's something that got transmitted that you could call brokenness between the war and the trauma. Trauma is defined in terms of a sort of brokenness. And if wholeness has got to do with peace on earth, goodwill toward men, then clearly war is the broken twin. These dichotomies are important because, in a sense, there is a dichotomy of forces at work in our world. And I believe that you can see those forces by what's the word I'm looking for? Following, that wasn't the word, following the connections between the causes and effects. And then this brokenness, this trauma, what happens, what what kind of brokenness in the upbringing of the Koch brothers and their destructive impact? What are the consequences of whatever made them so greedy or made Trump all the things that he is that are broken? And if you look at the consequences, again, you see that brokenness begets brokenness, that there is a transmission, something worth calling a force, which is what moves something. It is pushing this pattern of brokenness through history through the natural workings of cause and effect. So you can go back to the very beginnings of civilization. You can see certain kinds of brokenness emerging. You can see a war of all against all inevitably emerging because of the nature of the new situation, unprecedented situation, for a species that is budding out of with new kinds of societies. For the first time in the history of life, 3.5 billion years, 10 or 12,000 years ago, we have a species that's starting to pull itself out of the niche in which it evolved and create all kinds of different cultures that are out of the inventive intelligence of the creature, not having been selected by natural selection. But anyway, I claim that you can see the pattern of brokenness moving through the human world when you ask those questions about each thing. And you can do it for wholeness too. What are the effects of having a loving family rather than one that traumatizes you? I think you can see that wholeness begets wholeness and brokenness begets brokenness. And I don't know how thoroughly true that is. My sense is it's very, very true. And if all you need, I suggested in it earlier, is an initial impetus to get the whole thing started. If you put brokenness in, and then there's a momentum, and also the same situation of a war of all against all that leads to an inevitable selection for the ways of power and for the spirit of the gangster to get in a disproportionate say, because the step into civilization is a step into anarchy. Anarchy means a war of all against all, and a selective process dictates that only those cultural options that are conducive to surviving when in an intersocietal system in which there's a war of all against all going. So inevitably there is that impetus, and then there is this force that moves through the human world that I claim explains why our history has been as ugly as it has been. It's not a function of human nature. I claim that I can prove pretty well, and that's what that book, The Parable of Tribes, does, that any creature on any planet is going to, if it steps, as we did, out of its biologically evolved niche and starts to by inventing its own way of life, it leaves the natural order, which has been shaped so that there are synergies that perpetuate the system. That's the nature of what gets selected for in biological evolution. But all of a sudden, we've got this new thing going, where the selection for the ways of power in in a situation where way beyond any speed of biology, there's cultural evolution going on, so that you move from gardening and herding societies within a few millennia to empires ruled by tyrants that have enslaved the mass of people and who wage chronic war on their weaker neighbors to enslave still more people. It's a pattern we've seen around the world, and I say that it is inevitable and doesn't have to do with human nature. But we do have something to contend with, which is a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse. And we don't have that force under control. Boy, we sure don't in the United States. We sure don't, when even this old democracy couldn't couldn't make the obvious choice as a people. One of the great tragedies of history is that evil, I could go further with defining it and demonstrating it. I mean, all the ways in which the Trump campaign signaled it was the opposite of the better. It was the worst of the various dichotomies of hate and love and war and conflict, injustice and justice, and kindness, cruelty and kindness, all those things. They showed that they were consistently on one side of that divide. That was something that, yeah, it was clearly a consistent picture of something that makes the human world worse, a coherent force. And Americans, and I don't fault Kamala in the least. I think the problem with the Democrats is we probably lost this war a long time ago because we didn't fight for the hearts and minds of a lot of people who wouldn't, or their parents or grandparents back in Eisenhower, Reagan, first Bush, wouldn't have sided with something like this. But have been moved as part of the force of destruction into a place where way too many Americans could look at the options they were given and for one reason or another not reject the thing that so obviously any American who believes in this country's basic values and who has eyes in their head that are not blinded by some kind of trance or whatever would know must be rejected. Okay, those are some of the elements of the picture of evil that I've been trying to present in this series. I will continue to try to bring to life the reality of this coherent force. It pays, actually, in terms of how to fight and defeat it, to recognize it for what it is. And the Democratic Party, I think, had a great campaign with Kamala. But evidently, all those years when the pro-democracy side was sleeping through the rising danger, we've got, back in the 90s, I had the experience of gatekeepers for the radio platforms that I wanted to expand into from the smaller platforms I had, and would hear such things as, Rush Limbaugh's audience is no concern of ours. Well, here we are. It would have been good if people had been aware that there are coherent forces at work in our world, and sometimes they can congeal and become like a pure case of a single actor. Sometimes it's a nation, sometimes it's an individual, sometimes it's a political party that is so consistently doing things that are destructive that they actually are sort of an expression of evil. It is that the thing is that coherent force. The Nazi regime was a coherent force that consistently worked to make the human world more broken. I would say that slave power back in the 1850s and into the 60s was a coherent force that consistently worked to make things more broken. Pure cases leading to great destruction. Even if we aren't dealing with pure cases, as we are in America right now, because Trump and his party and his base are constructive in terms of the unfolding of our politics about 0% of our time. Not the Republican Democratic relationship people my generation grew up with, where there was a competition, but also within a context of some fundamental cooperation enough to get the people's business done. Where let me just turn that off. This is a time to see the coherent force at work, because it is a cancer that goes through the culture at a lot of different levels and a lot of different dimensions. I hope it's not too late to cure it, but we can at least start with the young. We should never again be in a situation where a majority of Americans could vote for something which checks just about every box about being a consistent force of brokenness, hate, and lying, and bullying, and greed, and lawlessness. All those boxes get checked by this one thing. It's good to be able to recognize a force of evil when it's starting to rise, because if you wait too long, you might wait too long. Thank you. Please subscribe or do something nice if you like what you heard. Please check out my other videos. And if you want to see my attempt to lay out in a very as clear and systematic a way as I can this integrated vision about the forces at work in the human world and the centrality of there being, in a sense, a battle between good and evil, which is an inevitable, says the social scientist, an inevitable consequence of the breakthrough into civilization. So that's on my website, abetterhumanstory.org. Thank you. Bye-bye.